What's up, skate fam? Welcome to Deez Skates. Today we're going to talk about the newest product from the Endless Blading Company, the ARC, which stands for Acceleration Response Control. I had my doubts as to whether I was going to like a 5-wheel frame. I know that 5 wheels is nothing particularly new. They were popular on inline speed skates when I was a kid, and I know there's been a resurgence in popularity the last few years since Wizard released their progressive rocker 5-wheel frames. I'm also aware that these two things don't directly compare to each other. What we're looking at now is more of a street style that blends flatland, flow skate with aggressive tricks. But if you know anything about me and my skating style, you know I tend to prefer shorter frames that provide more agility. My style is heavily inspired by dance. I'm not out doing a bunch of aggressive style tricks, and I'm not looking to get loads of air. So even though 5-wheel rocker frames will obviously provide more agility and maneuverability than the old school speed frames, I didn't expect to like them as much as I love these ARC frames. I know you want to hear about how they felt under my feet, but trust me, we're building up to that, and in this case, it's the little things that count. First off, they're 84, 80, 76. This means that the front and rear wheels can be 84mm or 80mm. The center 3 need to be 76mm. The front and back axles are rocker axles, so you can flip these with the dot pointed up to raise the front and back wheels, and flip them down to lower and get a more flat setup. Officially, you can see on the Endless website that they actually make 2 different types of rocker axles. There's one meant for the 84mm wheels, which I would call the standard ARC axles. It's what you get if you just order the frames and nothing else. And then there is the ARC Deluxe rocker axles, which are only meant to be used with the 80mm wheels. You can see here it says, these axles will allow you to achieve 2 levels of enhanced rocker with the Endless ARC 5-wheel frames when using 80mm wheels. These silver axles are different than the black ones included with the ARC frame sets. I don't have these. I only received the black axles, so I can't give you any insight on the different levels of rocker they're talking about here, but my interest is piqued enough that I'll probably order these at some point to use with my ARC frames. It's got me wondering what the rocker will feel like compared to the setup I was sent. When I pulled these prototypes out of the box early last year, the first thing I had to take notice of was these axles, which are used to change the rocker position on the front and back wheels. I own quite a few frames with this type of axle, from Seba to Powerslide. I've even tried some Flying Eagles as well, and though I love the freedom and options these flippable axles afford, I'm usually a little underwhelmed with them, especially the Seba axles, but even the Powerslides to some degree, they always feel a little cheap. I was curious if the axles that come with the ARC frames were actually heavier, and it turns out they weigh less than the Seba axles, but more than the Powerslides. Funny because the Seba axles are just bad. So they kind of fall into the middle, and it's really not a huge difference in weight, but when I opened the box, I just had to take a moment to appreciate the way they felt in my hand. The center 3 axles seem to be the same standard axles that have come with all the frames I've received in the past from Endless. And the most interesting thing to me is that these ARC frames come with longitudinal mount holes, meaning they can be finely positioned forward and backward, rather than only the latitudinal holes or left and right, like the other 165 frames I have from Endless. I feel like this is a good way to go with such a long frame, and because the rocker is more pronounced on this frame than previous Endless frames, I prefer having more freedom to move them forward and backward, in case I want to bias the rocker in a specific position under the ball of my foot. Also, I slapped together a mix of bearings with some satellite spacers in the middle. This allows me to challenge how they handle some variables. When Endless packages wheels with spacers and bearings, I know they send twin cam ILQ bearings and sonic spacers. Their official word on this is that these products work the best with their frames due to measured tolerances. I'm using some twin cam ILQ 9s and some sonic spacers, but I also have a mixture of Powerslide spacers and Inline warehouse branded ABEX 7 bearings. Also, I'm using junk wheels, which are made by NPC, and they are amazing, by the way. The first roll test I did with this setup worked pretty well, except for the second wheel didn't roll well. I figured out later that this is probably due to the bearings being dirty. They were quite used, and after my first skate session with this setup, the issue completely went away. I also did a later roll test to see how long the 84mm wheels would roll with generic ABEX 7 bearings in them. It took 1 minute and 50 seconds for the wheel to come to a dead stop. I'd say things are working pretty well here, and one thing I'd like to point out is that I tightened these axles down pretty tight before doing this test. I know I've said a few times in the past that I've encountered a lot of frames that I can't tighten the axles on really hard without losing some of the roll. It's like I reach a certain point where the boss of the frame begins to make contact with the bearing shield and it starts to restrict the roll. That's definitely not an issue I've had with endless frames that I've used in the past. In fact, with endless, I found that the wheels tend to sit perfectly into place between wheel and boss, and as I tighten the axles, I get better roll from the wheel. I was curious to know whether this would work the same with the flippable axle slots, and as far as I can tell, the experience is pretty much the same. Also, a concern that I had when I was told I'd be getting frames that have 76mm wheels in the center is that they would be slow. The group I normally skate with in the city all use big wheels. Many of them are pretty fast, and I didn't feel very optimistic about having to keep up with them with smaller wheels. Thankfully, that has not been an issue. Honestly, they're a lot faster than I'd anticipated. I'd say they feel about the same speed as my 4x90 or 3x110 setup. The length of the frame allows for a lot of surface contact and therefore a longer push, and these things are incredibly quick. Where I feel like they have a hard time compared to large wheels is when the surface I'm skating on starts to get really rough. But that is definitely not unique to these frames. In my experience, pretty much anything under 90mm is going to be less fit for rough roads and sidewalks, and to their merit, the 316mm wheelbase gives them a significant advantage over any four-wheel frames in the 243 to 260mm wheelbase range. So you can't expect them to perform in the street like a frame that's running 110mm wheels, but also you're not going to have anywhere near the same agility on those because the rocker on these things is without a doubt the best rocker that I've used to date on a larger frame. I've skated a lot of rockered frames, some 3 wheels, some 4 wheels, most made for slalom, some made for street. The Arc beats them all. I won't try to recommend these for slalom, but slalom frames are a very specialized thing. They don't do well in the city, and I know people who are looking at 5-wheel frames are thinking about street styles like wizard skating rather than slalom. The main difference between the Arc rocker and a typical slalom rocker is simply the amount of rocker that's available. For example, 4-wheel slalom frames tend to have a set amount of rocker with exactly 2mm of difference between the center 2 wheels and the 2 next to them on the front and back. So you're always on 2 wheels at any given time. It's consistent, yes, but the issue is that the change from wheel to wheel is very large, and while it works great in dance-focused skating, it is not great for the city. It's very unstable, and you cannot get a really good, strong push from your stride. The Arc, on the other hand, has a very pronounced rocker, but its transition from wheel to wheel is much more subtle and smooth in comparison. It's definitely more rocker than the balanced rocker on the other endless models that I've used, but I'll say with confidence that the stability is still just as good, if not better, due to the frame length. I've also used them without a rocker, flipping the front and back axles to lower the wheels. It feels like a flat setup, but because the second and fourth wheels are rockered up slightly from the center, it's not technically flat. There is a bit of anti-rocker with those 2 wheels, but just rolling the skate back and forth along my floor with a little bit of pressure forces the wheels to make contact. So I'm sure you can imagine why I can't feel any anti-rocker when I'm actually in the boots and I've got all my body weight over the skates. Though I can't say I spent a lot of time with them flat, probably a serious downhill is where I would really put that to the test. And I have run these downhill in the garage that I like to skate in, but I honestly prefer them rockered even then. Again, they're just so fast and wonderfully stable. Even rockered, I feel like there's almost no way that I can fall forward or backwards. I've dropped off ledges at high speeds, and the connection with the floor feels perfect and seamless. In the future, I'll be testing them for their agility, but right now, I'm still learning to adapt my style to them, so I'll have to save that for another episode. And to answer the question I know you've been thinking, I have no idea how these compare to other 5-wheel frames. I can only tell you my experience as someone who has never used 5-wheel frames until I tried the Arc. Hopefully in the future, I will get the opportunity to pit the Arc against 5-wheel frames from other companies. So make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And in return, here's a photo of the first 5-wheel inline skate ever made, the Volito. If you're interested in the history of the Volito, I'll leave a link to my history of roller skating video where I cover it more in depth. And I promise that the next time I upload content about these frames, I'll have more to say about skating downhill on a flat setup. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you the next time I lace up.
We'll turn this around.